Hello, and welcome to my Real Estate Exam Prep podcast series. I've already helped hundreds of students start their real estate careers, and my goal here is to help you pass your exams. You can check out all 11 podcasts in this National Exam Prep series, and for more detailed information, you can watch my full-length videos on each topic. Today I want to talk a little bit about property disclosure requirements and what you're going to need to know about them to pass your exams. I'll start out with keywords and key concepts, and then we'll discuss in detail the types of test questions you can expect. Sellers today in all states are certainly required to make a seller's property disclosure statement, sharing with any potential buyer what they know about their property. Now, this is a National Exam Prep podcast, so we won't get into what your state requires, but they will ask you on the national exam, does every state require some sort of seller's property disclosure? That's true, they do. But the form can vary by each state, and actually some of the definitions of things that have to be disclosed can vary by state. So we'll stick with the broad national angle here when we discuss this. So all sellers are required to disclose what they know about their property. Every state requires the sellers make disclosure of material facts. So what's your definition of a material fact? You'll need to know this for the exam. It's any fact, anything that might affect a buyer's decision to buy the property. And if that sounds pretty broad brush and subjective, it truly is. So anything that might affect a buyer's decision, that means not only on the property itself, but outside the property boundaries. Things like the house being in the flight path of an airport runway, or airplanes taking off and landing every day on a regular basis. That is a material fact. A railroad train passing within a block or two of the property and rattling dishes off the cupboard shelves when it goes by. That certainly would be a material fact. So remember, it's not just specific property conditions, but it's things outside the property boundaries also. So here's the other key points that are very testable about the seller's property disclosure. Another one is that only the owner of the property should fill out the property disclosure statement. And by extension, never the real estate agent. You as a real estate salesperson and agent should never, ever put a finger on or handle the seller's property disclosure. Quite frankly, if you get involved in filling out that seller's property disclosure and something turns out to be fraudulent, you could be liable for that. And the seller will likely throw you under the bus and say it's your fault if there's a problem with the seller's property disclosure. So please, the answer to the test question, who should fill out the seller's property disclosure? Only the owner of the property should do that. The other thing you'll run into on the exam, and actually in the marketplace, is this form only has to disclose information about the property to the best of the seller's actual knowledge. It's not a warranty that there's never been a problem with the house. It's only the sellers stating whether they're aware of any problems with the house. I bring that up because I remember years ago when I started in real estate, I had a seller ask me, what if the house I want to sell now used to have water damage and I don't know about it? Do I have to disclose that? And I had to pause for a second and say to the seller, you have to think about that question a little bit. You're asking me if you have to disclose something you don't know about. My response is, how could you disclose it? No, you don't have to. You don't know about it, for heaven's sakes. You don't have to disclose it. And I bring that up because it's to the best of the seller's actual knowledge is going to be one of the answers on your test question, on your test. So we talked about material facts that have to be disclosed. Some states will have different definitions of what is or is not a material fact. So be sure and review your state section before you take your state exam. However, on the national side, material facts are what have to be disclosed. Now, those can be, as we mentioned, physical facts about the property itself or environmental issues. Those things external to the property. All of those are considered to be material facts because they might affect a buyer's decision. Another question on the exam is going to be, when do these disclosures by the seller have to be made? And here's where I want you to be careful when you take the exam. So the answer to the question is, what is the requirement for when the seller has to make these disclosures? The correct answer is before accepting and signing a purchase agreement from a buyer. Well, that makes common sense. Buyers have to be aware before the seller accepts a purchase offer from a buyer. But in reality, I want to talk about this for a second, that's not necessarily what happens in the marketplace. What happens in the marketplace is a real estate salesperson will list a house, and the seller will typically make the seller's property disclosures form, will fill that out at the time the property is listed or shortly thereafter. And then that property disclosure statement is set out for any potential buyers to see. So certainly those buyers would have the disclosure before they even make an offer. But the correct answer for the test is sellers have to make these disclosures before they accept an offer from a buyer. And the reason I want to stress that is, here's the answer choices you'll have. You know by now that all of your test questions will be multiple choice with 4 choices. So here's your choice. The question will be, when does the seller have to make these disclosures? Your choices will be when the property is listed, before a second showing, before the first showing, or before the seller signs a purchase agreement. So don't get caught up in what actually happens in the marketplace today. Make sure you're just answering the test question as it's asked, which is, what does the law require? So before signing a purchase agreement is the correct answer. Here's a couple other concepts about the property disclosure statement that the test writers are certain to weave into some questions in your exam. Sellers will ask you, what if I'm selling my property as is? Do I still need to make a disclosure? The answer is yes, all disclosures are still required, even if the seller's selling their property as is. Here's a good note to make, or a good thing to remember before you take your exam. When a seller sells their property as is, all that means is that they're not going to make any repairs. As is means no repairs. They're still required to make all the lawfully required disclosures on their property. That doesn't absolve them of any responsibility. Another question you'll find from sellers, and you're likely to see on your exam, what if the seller says, my basement used to flood, but I fixed the problem. So I've never had water damage in my basement for the last 3 years. So since I used to have a problem and now I've fixed the problem, do I need to disclose that I used to have a problem? The answer is absolutely yes. Absolutely. Sellers are required to disclose everything they know about a property that might affect the buyer's decision. So if they had a leaky roof or a wet basement or some other issue and they fixed it, tell your sellers and make it clear on the exam that they still must disclose that. And in for practical reasons in the marketplace, tell your sellers, over disclose. Tell potential buyers that. Here's the problem for a seller who wants to hide something or not fully disclose something. If a buyer can ever prove that the seller lied or misrepresented something on their seller's disclosure, and the burden of proof is on the buyer to do that. But if the buyer can do that, then the responsibility falls back on the seller to fix the problem and repair the damage done and to make sure that the problem doesn't recur again. And that can be an expensive fix in some cases. So don't tell your seller to try and skip over or hide any disclosures. Please stress to them, yes, over disclose. It's better off to tell a buyer, the seller's better off to let a buyer know, I used to have a water problem and I fixed it, and now I haven't had a water problem in the last few years. Now the buyer knows that, and the buyer's happy it was fixed, and the buyer's typically satisfied that the seller said it doesn't leak anymore, or they don't have a water problem. However, it puts the buyer on notice that there may be a problem, or there has been a problem in the past, and they may want to get their own home inspection to see if it was truly fixed or fixed properly. So tell your sellers, as is only means no repairs, and even if you fixed a problem, it still must be disclosed. A couple other vocabulary words I just want to touch on real quick. You'll see test questions on your exam about different types of defects in the property and problems. There are two different types of defects. They are visible and latent defects. Visible, certainly ones you can see, and latent defects are those hidden somewhere, hidden maybe behind the walls or in the attic or whatever. A very common latent defect is mold. Mold nowadays is very common in many homes, but if you can't see it, a buyer may want to get a home inspection to have a home inspector possibly look for those latent defects. But your sellers will ask you this, and on the exam you'll be asked this: is a seller responsible to disclose latent defects? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely. The seller is responsible for those if the seller knows about them. Obviously, if the seller doesn't know there is mold behind the wall, then they can't disclose that because they don't know if there isn't mold behind the wall. But if the seller knows of a mold issue, and I've had sellers ask me that, well, I think there's mold growing behind our walls, but nobody can see it, so do I still need to disclose that? And the answer is yes. In fact, not only do sellers have to make those disclosures, I want to touch on this for a minute. Since the seller just told you as their listing agent, they know there's mold behind the wall, but they may not want to disclose it. Since you as the salesperson and agent on that listing, since you now know from the seller there's mold behind that wall, you must disclose it, even if the seller doesn't want to. A listing agent must disclose those things they know about. So be aware of that fact and watch for those types of test questions. You will see several questions on your exam about hazardous materials. So let's go over some of the key ones that often show up on your exam and go over the highlights or the key points for those. The big one here, the one you'll see the most questions on, is lead-based paint requirements. Lead-based paint disclosure requirements. Now, this hazardous material does have federal disclosure requirements. So that's why you'll see most of the questions on the national exam about lead-based paint. So here's the key points you want to remember for the exam. If the house was built before 1/1/1978, excuse me, January 1st, 1978, remember that date, then these federal lead-based paint disclosure requirements apply. So if it's older than that, first of all, the seller is required to disclose any known presence of lead-based paint. If they know about lead-based paint in the house, they must disclose it, okay? The seller has to provide a potential buyer with a booklet, Protect Yourself from Lead in Your Home. That booklet is provided by all brokers, but it's a seller requirement if the house was built prior to that date. Provide them with that booklet. Here's a key point for the test. The seller is not required to remove any lead-based paint. They're only required to share information with a potential buyer about any lead-based paint they know about. So does the seller have to remove it? No, they don't. And the seller must give each buyer, potential buyer who makes an offer, a 10-day period to have the home inspected for lead-based paint. That's mandatory 10-day home inspection if the house was built before 1/1/78 to give a buyer a chance to inspect the house for lead-based paint if they want to. Now I say if they want to because this is another key fact for the exam. The buyer can waive that 10-day inspection period. So maybe you have a buyer who says, I'm going to come into the house and do an awful lot of rebuilding and renovation here, so I don't need the 10 days. I don't care. I'm going to do so much work. I want to waive the 10-day period. So if the buyer wants the 10 days, it's there for them to use to do a home inspection for lead-based paint. But if the buyer doesn't want to take the time, the buyer may waive that. Okay? So those are all key points about lead-based paint. Please review those, and in your course material from your education provider, review those lead-based paint requirements. Here's a few other hazardous materials that you'll see in the national exam. However, for these, there are no federal disclosure laws like there are for lead-based paint. We'll talk first about asbestos. Now, when you study these hazardous materials, I think what you should do is make word association lists. When you get a chance, grab a notepad and make your own word association list when you're studying. These three hazardous materials I want to go over with you often come up, but the questions come up in the form of how are they dealt with? What are the word associations with each one of the next three? The first one is asbestos. Asbestos is dealt with in two different ways, either through abatement or encapsulation. Abatement means removal. Should be done by professionals, should be done with full hazmat suits. It's a very dangerous job. So asbestos is either abated or encapsulated, which means sealed up in place. Many older homes today have furnace systems that had asbestos wrapping the ducts, the exposed furnace ducts in the basement of the house. Is it still legal to sell a house that still has asbestos wrapped furnace ducting? Yes, it is, as long as that furnace ducting is encapsulated. So, two word associations for asbestos: abatement or encapsulation. And again, there's no federal disclosure law for asbestos. Next material I want to just mention is radon. Radon is a hazardous gas that only becomes detrimental to somebody's health if the radon gas is trapped in the house. Now today our homes are insulated so well that radon gas comes up from the ground everywhere all the time. It's just a fact of life. It's something we all deal with. Has never been a problem in the past because radon gas doesn't get trapped in homes. But now, because our homes are built so tight, insulated so well, radon gas that does come up from under the ground and get into the house is typically trapped in the house. So, how is radon dealt with if there are serious radon levels in a home? Radon is mitigated. Mitigated is the word association for radon, and that means lessen the severity of the radon. And how do you do that? That's through a ventilation system. Ventilation system, blow the radon gas out. Okay? Some states have a mandatory radon ventilation system built into their building codes for new construction as of about the last 8 or 10 years. Some building municipalities say it is fine if there is one bathroom fan in the house that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that is exhaust ventilation. That would move enough radon gas out probably to not create a problem. But word associations for the exam, radon is mitigated through ventilation. And once again, there is no federal disclosure law for radon. The last one we'll talk about is mold. Mold, once again, sellers must disclose any presence of mold that they are aware of. So they have to disclose the presence of mold if it's there, and it's also the fact that there is no federal disclosure law for mold. And you should be aware too that most homeowners insurance policies, hazard insurance for homeowners, doesn't cover the presence of mold. That can lead to some expensive repairs. So in some cases, a buyer, if they suspect there might be mold in a house they want to make an offer on, they might be smart to have a mold inspection done. However, for your national exam, seller has to disclose mold, excuse me, and there is no federal disclosure requirement for mold. Here are two acronyms I want you to be aware of regarding hazardous materials and cleaning up of hazardous materials on a large scale, maybe contaminated land from an old power plant or an old automobile manufacturing facility or whatever. But the first one is CERCLA. CERCLA established the Superfund for cleaning up hazardous waste sites, and it regulates the disposal and the handling of hazardous waste materials when they're removed from a site. And an add-on to CERCLA is SARA, S-A-R-A. SARA is an amendment to CERCLA that regulates the cleanup of a hazardous waste site, and it stressed certain penalties if somebody doesn't do the work correctly. And both of those deal with, again, the cleanup of large-scale hazardous waste sites. And that's all you'll need to know for your exam. CERCLA and SARA deal with the cleanup of hazardous waste sites. They establish the Superfund, and they establish penalties for not doing the cleanup properly. A couple other acts you may want to know for your exam with regard to disclosures are the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And they regulate exactly what they talk about. The Clean Air Act regulates emissions, and it authorizes the EPA to regulate the types of emissions and air pollutants that get into the air. And the Clean Water Act certainly regulates and the discharge of pollutants into the surface waters of the United States. So know about the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, basically what they do. You might see 1 or 2 questions on each one of those on your exam. So there are the key testable concepts and keywords for your property disclosure statement that all sellers must fill out. I hope you found the information helpful, informative. If you want more detail, you can check out my full lesson video on property disclosures on my YouTube channel at Tom's Next Level Real Estate. So check out my exam insights and strategies video, and I have several other specific topic videos you may find of interest. So thank you for listening, and good luck on your exams.